Welcome to Seeking Delphi, episode number 54, The End of Jobs with Jeff Wald. I'm Mark Sackler. The future lives here. Automation, robotics, artificial intelligence, those words conjure up images in many of us of a future devoid of work. And that fear is not new. But how real is that fear? In 2019, I wrote an essay on the Seeking Delphi blog asserting that the next few years might be telling but not decisive. In March of 2020, which seems like a lifetime ago in the age of COVID-19, I interviewed Millennium Project CEO Jerome Glenn regarding his organization's massive Work 2050 study. It outlined several possible scenarios. In today's program, I take another look at the question of the future of work, this time from the standpoint of an expert insider. Jeff Wald is an entrepreneur, venture capitalist, and author of The End of Jobs: The Rise of On-Demand Workers and the Agile Corporation. The book represents its own scenarios, and the main conclusion of The End of Jobs may not be what you think the title suggests. Let's hear what he has to say. Jeff, welcome, and thanks for joining me on Seeking Delphi.
It is wonderful to be here.
My first question to you is a pretty simple one, and that is in regards to your book. What is it that brought you on this journey? What in your past, both distant and recent past, brought you to write this book?
Well, I'll tell you, Mark, it's one of my favorite questions. It doesn't have a simple answer. I wish it had a simple answer, but annoyance is really what led me to write the book. Is I just kept getting annoyed at people who make predictions about the future of work. Now, as the founder of Work Market, and we were enterprise software to help companies manage their freelancers, I would go to conferences and I would speak on panels and I would hear other speakers and they would say, oh, the on-demand labor force is going to grow to 50%. And I was like, no, it isn't. Like that's a ridiculous statement. It's not based on the history of work. It's not based on the data on the on-demand labor market. It's not based on how companies actually engage workers. It never was going to come true, but that was the prediction everybody was making in the early 2010s as I was building Work Market. And I thought there needs to be some clarity brought, because anyone that is going to make a prediction about the future of anything, quite frankly, should be doing it based on a body of evidence. But in the world of work, there are three particular bodies of evidence that I view as vital. One is the history of work, because as we all know, history tends to rhyme, so you should always study history if you're going to understand the present or predict the future. There are the data patterns around the world of work today, and certainly the data trends and patterns as they've persisted through the world of work through its history. And then there's how companies actually engage workers. You know, a lot of people say, oh, well, companies are just going to go in and engage the cheapest labor source. You go, well, actually, that's not how labor resource planning meetings go. The entire executive team doesn't get in a room and somebody says, so what do we do with our workers next year? Hire the cheapest workers. Okay, great. Meeting done. Everybody enjoy your day. That's not how companies engage workers. Cost is certainly a factor, and on-demand labor is certainly a factor. But the idea that companies were all of a sudden going to switch all of their workers to freelancers was ridiculous. So that was what led me to write a book focused first on the on-demand labor market. And as I started to unpack it, it very quickly became the entire labor market. What can we learn from history, from data, from how companies actually engage workers in order to make meaningful, thoughtful, and high probability predictions about the future of work? And that's what I hope we've delivered with the book.
We'll get to the implications of your title, what the pieces of it may mean, and your look to the future in a bit. But first, I want to kind of look at some of the things you talk about in the early parts of the book, where you talk about kind of where we are now and how we've gotten there. I'm not going to go all the way back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, but most of it the relevant changes right now that have brought us to where we are maybe began in the wake of the Great Depression and the New Deal. So there's basically 5 things to talk about here. And the first one is you very prominently talk about, and you also kind of talk about it as sort of a myth, and that's LEC, lifetime employment contract. So what is employed there, and how real or unreal has that been over the last century or so?
The short answer, Mark, is that we don't know. There aren't a huge volume, there aren't volumes and volumes of data in the world of work pre-1960. 1960, we get the Bureau of Labor Statistics really coming into its own and starting to keep a lot of data. And pre-1960, we don't know much. But when we look at the fact that in 1960, the average American, so obviously differs, different jobs, different ages and things like that, different industries, the average American stayed in a job for 5 years. And if that's the case, and it is, then how do we juxtapose that with the idea that, oh, everybody used to work at the same company for 40 years and go to their gold watch? And my answer to that is, well, that is the truth for some workers at some companies. But to pretend that that was the standard for employment in America, I just don't have any data to support that. So I think when we think about the lifetime employment contract, I like to think of it as a notion. It's a wonderful idea that there's one company that you work for your whole life, and they're looking after you while you look after them, and they think about your training and your development and their health care and your retirement. And that's great. But I'm not sure it ever really, really existed, at least in any way of scale, and not certainly in any way that's shown up in the data. So it, to me, is a notion. But when people say, oh, things used to be so different and they used to be better, for who? For who was it better? For some people, sure. But I get very interested in people that say, oh, things used to be so much better back then. And I struggle to find the data to support the idea that that really was a standard.
The second one, which has seen some interesting movement and has been, I guess, heading down over the last few years, in part maybe because of baby boomers retiring, and that's labor force participation. So talk about that.
So that to me is the granddaddy of all labor statistics. And all of these things that we're talking about here, the lifetime employment contract, did it exist or not? The labor force participation rate, what does the data tell us? These are those bodies of evidence, right? This is the history of work, and let's understand the history and what really was happening, what companies and workers were going through. And let's really understand the data and the labor force participation rate. I love the labor force participation rate. That's the granddaddy of all labor stats. That is simply, in the numerator, everybody that is working in any context, and in the denominator, everybody that could be working, that is of working age and capability. And so unlike the unemployment rate, which includes people that are actively looking, not people that have dropped out of the labor force, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to manage or massage the labor force participation rate. And what we saw historically was in the 1950s, 1960s, the labor force participation rate around 55, 56, and it slowly creep up. Little dips during recessions, clearly, but slowly creep up to a peak of 66.3% in 2000 at the height of the internet boom. And the biggest driver of that was actually women entering the labor force in a much more prominent way than it existed in the 1950s and 1960s. And the baby boom population going from pre-employment to employment. And we saw it stay, or after the dot-com bubble burst, it stayed around 66, 65, and then huge drop down to 62 in the Great Recession. And it's never really recovered. There have been people that have moved to long-term disability. There are people that have just stopped working entirely. Some of that is retirement. And we have gotten back before COVID to 63.5%. But I don't know that we ever get back to 66%. I think it stays at 63% time. And those things, looking at that data and looking how those numbers trend over time, those are important things to study when making predictions on the future of work. If somebody came and said, oh, the US labor force is going to be 300 million by this point, I'm going to go, what? Really? So you think the labor force statistics participation rate is going to go from 63% up to 92? Like that would have no basis. That would be undefensible. So it helps me in understanding all these statistics, how they've moved over time, what's moved them over time, as I think about making predictions about the future of work.
Okay, well, here's one that there were some radical predictions on when I was younger, maybe back in my teens when people were getting aware, back even as far back as the 60s, of the potential for automation
Mm-hmm.
to make jobs more productive, if not remove them. And that, of course, is the hours per week work,
Mm-hmm.
the average hours. So that actually hasn't changed as much lately, I understand it, as it did in the first couple hundred years of industrial revolution.
That is certainly true. We did start out as a society working 3,500 hours per year. And then as we got in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, you get to about 3,000. Through the first and second industrial revolutions, we start moving down to our standard of everyone thinks, which is that 2,000 hours a year, that 40 hours a week times 50 weeks. But the reality today is that we have had a 10% reduction over the last 50 years. So the average American today works 1,780 hours, not 2,000 hours. And what's interesting is the average German works 1,500 hours. The average person in France, 1,450 hours. Average person in Mexico, by the way, 2,200 hours. So you can see the difference in different countries in their development and where they are from an industrial development standpoint. You can see differences in their societal contracts and what it means to be an employee in different companies in different countries. But what we see is a very, very clear trend through the history of work of humans working fewer and fewer hours and being able to achieve a higher and higher standard of living. That is a very clear, unmistakable, and hopefully uninterrupted trend in human history.
Yes, it seems to me that those Europeans get more paid vacation than Americans
That they
do.
do.
I had that discussion with a Frenchman years ago when I was visiting France over 20 years ago, when I said that I had 2 weeks of paid vacation, and he called it slave labor because he got a full paid month every August when his factory shut down, in addition to maybe some other paid time off. So yeah, big difference
Very
country
true.
to country. Okay, and of course, here's a big one that a lot of us think of. Particularly, I remember a lot of the strikes when I was growing up. There were newspaper strikes, teacher union strikes, and that's unions, and they're not what they used to be, but they're not necessarily dead either, I guess.
They are very far from dead. The union movement peaked in the United States at about 30% of employment in the post-war period, and it went through a slow and steady decline, and we get to today where union workers are 7% of the labor force. What's interesting is that union membership itself has actually remained pretty stable over the last 20, 30 years in terms of the number of people that belong to a union. It's about 15 million. But the number of workers in the US economy continues to grow. So that 15 million represents a smaller and smaller percent of the labor force. What's also interesting is that union sentiment, the positive view of unions, is at its highest. While union membership as a percent of the labor force is at its lowest in about 100 years, union sentiment's at about its highest. People like the idea of a union. There's a lot that can be said, Mark, about the union movement and its benefits and some corruption and a host of other things, and we're not going to touch any of that. Unions are designed to be incredibly beneficial for workers, and for the most part, throughout human history, it is very clear that they are. The union movement today has a host of issues and a host of challenges it needs to overcome to adapt itself for the modern workforce. What gives me a lot of hope, because workers need some sort of collective voice. That voice, does it need to be the union movement as it exists? Maybe. We could debate and discuss that. But what gives me hope is something like the Fight for 15. So the Fight for 15 started out of the union movement, started out of the SEIU in Seattle to push for a $15 minimum wage. But it morphed. It morphed into a nationwide movement, a grassroots, non-union activist-led movement all across this country were workers in different industries united in this common cause of a living wage of $15 an hour, and they agitated for change. And you know what? They are getting it. We have seen state after state put itself on a path to a $15 minimum wage. We now have a president-elect that has part of his platform raising the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. And so you can debate whether or not increasing the minimum wage is positive for workers or negative for workers. Obviously, workers have a very specific point of view that I actually happen to share, that it is positive for workers. The negative, of course, being that the higher you push that minimum wage floor, the more incentive companies have to disengage with workers, to use automation or other technologies to decrease the number of workers. There's very little evidence to support that. But the idea of more of the economic pie going to workers, when we've seen worker and wage stagnation over the last 30 years, there's a very powerful argument to be made that that is a necessary thing for society and certainly for workers. And it didn't come from the unions. It came from workers using social media and uniting in common cause across disparate industries to agitate for that change. And that gives me a lot of hope about how workers might use social media, might use new technologies to fight together in common cause for their share of the economic pie.
That's interesting, and it's interesting in terms of the public perception. And the public perception, maybe it's better because there's been less noise, negative noise lately, because for someone of my age as a baby boomer, the first thing that comes to mind when you say unions is Jimmy Hoffa. So,
Sure.
you know, and a younger generation hasn't maybe been exposed to that unless they watched The Irishman earlier this year.
Or another Robert De Niro movie,
Yeah.
Hoffa.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, look, that is the connotation for good or for ill. That's the connotation, and I will say it's unfortunate because unions should play a very productive role in the creation of economic benefit for all of society. But it seems there are certainly at least some examples of unions not being as virtuous as they could be in fighting for the worker.
All right, one final item here as to where we are now, and it's what you hear a lot of. It's the gig economy, on-demand workers, which a lot of people assume is exploding. In your book, you indicated it hasn't grown as much as people think as a percentage of the workforce. Although I wonder if maybe at least temporarily, with the demand for so many delivery drivers, that maybe it has grown somewhat during COVID. But why don't you talk about how we got where we are and how we got there?
Well, very important point on COVID, which is we don't know how much work has shifted and what's happened just yet. And so people that say, oh, this has happened because of COVID or that's happened, my answer usually is, well, we don't have the data yet. We have a sense. But to your point, there was a general sense over the last 10 years that the on-demand economy exploded, that it was eating up the labor force. There were predictions that 50% of the workforce would be on demand by 2020. And here we are in 2020, and no, not remotely close. On-demand labor isn't new. The idea of working with freelancers in a gig context, it's not new. Uber's new, and Uber is certainly a very powerful company in the gig space, and it is new. It did not exist, and now it's on the front pages and it's in our pockets, and that's very important, and it drives a lot of the narrative. But the on-demand labor force, Mark, has been 25 to 30% of the labor force. We don't know exact statistics here because the data is difficult to get at, but 25 to 30% of the labor force for like 30 years or so. It's been around for a very, very long time at this level. It's an important part of the labor force. The data that we do have over the last 10 years would tell us three different stories. One is there might be some slow growth that has occurred in the on-demand labor force, picking up 2-3% market share from full-time labor over a 10-year period. So that is growth, but it is not taking it from 25% to 50%. It's taking it from 25% to 27%, ballpark. That's one story we see from the data. The second story we see from the data is it's about the same size. And that's from the longest running longitudinal study by a firm called MBO Partners, about the same size as it was 10 years ago. And then we have a third story that we hear from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Pretty good at labor statistics, that bureau. And they would tell us that the on-demand economy has shrunk over the last 15 years. And so regardless of which of them is correct, because again, data here is tough to get to, the idea that it has grown explosively, I have zero data to support that. Zero. So the narrative there, the one I believe, based on the data I've seen, the reports that I've read and helped create, is that we've seen some slow and steady growth in the on-demand labor force over the next 10 years, and we'll continue to see some slow and steady growth over the next 10.
Let's move on now to talk about the future. After all, this is first and foremost a futurist podcast. But to do that first, let's get back and take a look at the title of the book.
Okay.
The End of Jobs, the Rise of On-Demand Workers in the Agile Corporation. Well, in the middle there, on-demand workers, we think we kind of all have a good idea what that is, and we just talked about it. I'm going to start at the back end of it first. What is an Agile Corporation?
So an Agile Corporation is a company that has variabilized as much of its cost structure as possible, meaning it can be very responsive or agile to any changes in revenue. If revenue is growing, they can very quickly add workers, very quickly add resources, inventory, whatever it is. And if revenue is falling, they can very quickly shed those same costs. And so being agile means being able to be responsive to the revenue signals that you're getting in the market. And companies that use more on-demand labor are able to be more agile than companies that use full-time employees. Most companies' largest cost is their labor, and most labor is engaged in the corporate setting as a fixed cost. It is very difficult in the near term to just get rid of workers. We have laws, we have severance policies, we have policies around termination, versus a freelancer, you decide the freelancer is no longer profitable for you, you can stop him or her in that minute.
I'm going to probably, as we look at the near, midterm, and long-term future, get into the beginning of the book title, the main book title, The End of Jobs, because
Sure.
that a little bit strikes me as clickbait in that you're saying it's not, at least not going to be the end of work. Jobs will change. Certain jobs will go away, others will be created, and many will be, if not most, will be transformed. That's my takeaway from the book. How do you see that?
I can't disagree with you. It is clickbaity. I'm not going to lie. That is true. That is true. Because people do have a general impression that robots are going to take jobs and we're going to have what is known as technological unemployment. And I fundamentally disagree with that. I do not believe that that is a high probability of coming true, and we walk through why in the book. The end of jobs, as I think about it, is the end of the job people have known for the last 60, 70 years. One boss, one office, 9 to 5. That job has been ending for the last 30 years. That job is at its end, and that job is being replaced by what we call the fluid, team-based, work from anywhere, always-on job. And so that's the transition of the job market, certainly not technological unemployment, but that is on the top of people's minds, and so certainly the publisher felt that The End of Jobs was a catchy title.
So your look at the future, you broke into two parts. You have a near to midterm future and a longer term future. And near-term future, again, midterm, obviously less radical change. You describe that as more incremental, but increasingly shifting to agile corporations. Fill us in a little bit on that.
Well, it's important to understand that when you look at labor statistics and you study history, you see that labor statistics move incredibly, incredibly slowly. People have this idea, Mark, that a new thing exists, a new technology, a new process, a new product, and then boom, all the jobs that used to be done by a person now are able to be done by that technology, so all the jobs go. That has never, ever, ever happened. So let's say for a second that magically self-driving cars become capable, and we are years and years away from self-driving cars being road ready. I mean, maybe a decade or two, but let's say they were. It would not be the case that every single professional driver, and there are 4.4 million professional drivers in the United States of America, they would not all be out of work. Over 20 years? Yes. Yeah, over 20 years, a very large percentage would be out of work. Not all of them, because customer service and a host of other things you're going to want a human there. But the idea that just because a technology exists means all the jobs get displaced, that has just never, ever happened, and it won't ever happen. And so the idea that there is going to be some fundamental shift in the labor force, okay, maybe, but its propagation through the economy takes time. And so that's what I mean when I'm talking about the slow and steady movement to agile corporations, the slow and steady movement towards a host of things in the world of work, is that history, data, and how companies actually engage workers tell us a very different story than immediate change.
We get to the kind of the juicy stuff, and that's the long term, which, as a futurist, I don't like to make firm predictions long term and make very few short term, other than that something like this is likely to happen and a lot of times I do see stuff ahead of even the media picking it up and whatever, but it's tough. As futurists, we know there are almost an infinite number of possible futures. You broke this out to two broad potential scenarios for the long-term future. So let's talk about the two of them. The first one is the Skynet future. Sounds ominous.
It does sound ominous. And, that is the scenario that people talk about in the technological unemployment model, the doom of the robots and AI taking over. And it's not that they're going to launch a war on humanity, although some people think that they may. It is this technological unemployment. And I will tell you this, in the beginning of any great technological step function, any great leap forward, as we saw in history with mechanization, electrification, and computerization, you always have the Skynet people, where people say, oh my gosh, all the jobs are going to be gone, we're going to be totally screwed, and we have to stop this at all costs because society is going to crumble. And they're always wrong. Now, am I saying definitively that they're wrong this time? No, I wouldn't say that. To your point, I think it's very difficult when making predictions about the future of work to be 70 certainty. I could say that the data doesn't point to that, history doesn't point to it, and a host of other things, but we'll see. And those are all the things that get wrapped up in the Skynet scenario. I think the Skynet scenario for us gets magnified by social media and news cycles and things like that. And I'll point to a great study done by McKinsey, one of my favorite organizations, and the McKinsey Institute puts out some incredible research. And they put out a piece of research, I think it was 2018, and it said 50% of jobs are susceptible to automation. And that headline became, McKinsey predicts 50% of jobs are going to go. And the reality is that's not what that report said at all. Susceptible to automation means something incredibly different than that job is going to go. But it became, McKinsey predicts in the next 20 years, 50% of jobs are going to go. And that's dangerous. And it leads to a lot of narratives, whether it's narratives from a family standpoint, a community standpoint, a company standpoint, a political standpoint. And it's important that people understand what the Skynet scenario is, what its probabilities are, what goes into predicting it, because on the other side of that is we have the Rosie Jetson scenario.
And that sounds pretty interesting. Also, being of that era when I watched the Jetsons as a kid. Reading it, it sounds a little bit like the Peter Diamandis abundance scenario in a way. So tell us what your Rosie Jetson scenario is.
Well, I'm a huge fan of Peter and the X Prize and everything that goes on there. And statistically, we are in a period of abundance. It's a wonderful thing. The Rosie Jetson scenario is the idea that robots and AI will take over all our repetitive high-volume tasks. And as humanity, we will be able to work very few hours in order to achieve a very high standard of living. And we can focus a lot of our time on leisure and science and art and family and all kinds of wonderful things. And I do think that we end up there as a society at some point. Do I think that that's our 20-year view? Absolutely not. The idea that Rosie Jetson is going to be in your home, for those of us that have had a chance to go to the Boston Dynamics facilities and actually see their robots, and for those that have not been to the facilities, you should definitely go onto YouTube and look at their videos of robots doing backflips and jumping upstairs. And it's incredible and it's impressive what they can achieve. But the idea that that robot's going to be in your home doing your cooking, your cleaning, and your laundry, no, that's not going to happen anytime in the next 20 years. Hard no. I will make whatever prediction or bet you need to make on this one. We will not have a mass adoption of robots in people's homes at that point.
Before we wrap this up, you did make your own forecast. We'll call it a forecast, not a prediction. Are there any other points of that forecast you'd like to make? And also tell us a little bit about this workflow or worker flow software that you developed.
So there are a lot of predictions in the book, some by me, some by some people much smarter than me. And they are predictions, Mark, based on history, based on data, based on how companies engage workers. So I feel very confident that the on-demand labor market will continue to grow slowly and steadily. I feel very confident that the union movement will morph in some way, and we'll actually see an increase in the percent of workers that belong to unions, but union structures will change. I believe that the U.S. labor force will end up growing over the next 20 years, which is actually not an easy prediction to make because most industrial labor forces are shrinking. Labor force in Germany, in Japan, in China, in France, in the UK is shrinking as the baby boom generation retires and as we are not producing enough new workers in the form of babies or immigrants. The United States has a slightly higher birth rate than the rest of the industrial world, although it has been dropping over the last few years. But our biggest benefit to our workforce has been immigration. And we certainly saw a curtailing of that with the current administration, but we'll see a quick reversal. I think to the benefit of workers, companies, and society as a whole. And I'm happy to debate anybody that think immigrants are a net negative for society. It's a ridiculous point of view that has no basis in fact. So all that being said, I'll hit your other question, which was on this workflow software, and that's what we kind of call total talent management. And it was the reason that ADP, the world's largest human capital management company, bought my company, bought the company I founded. And it was the idea that you want to take ADP's software and processes for full-time workers and bolt on WorkMarket's process and software for part-time or on-demand workers. And that way a company can manage all of its workforce in one place. And one of my favorite quotes in the book is, "The future's already here, it's just not evenly distributed," which is to say, I do think that's the future of work, and there are companies that are doing it today.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And we'll post a link to your book online, and we look forward to seeing how some of this stuff plays out and maybe talking again sometime in the future.
I very much look forward to it because the future lives here.
My take on the end of jobs? The book is well written and presents cogent, realistic arguments. What do I think will happen? The essay referenced in my introductory remarks and linked on the Seeking Delphi webpage for today's program expresses my view for the short term. As for the long term, Jeff Wald's two scenarios represent the extreme ends of plausibility from nightmare to reverie. The reality will almost certainly be somewhere in between. But the possible scenarios in the complex, chaotic confusion that is human society are almost endless. I won't make any firm predictions. I'm a futurist, not a psychic. Appropriate links, including the Amazon.com listing for the end of jobs, are available at www.seekingdelphi.com. The early months of 2021 will feature podcasts on advances in healthcare technology, the future of the digital divide, and more installments in the longevity dialogues. Be sure to like and follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and subscribe to these programs on Apple Podcasts, Player FM, or YouTube. Thanks for joining me. My technical assistant is Mohammed Maruth. Until next time, I'm Mark Sackler.